Well, good evening. I've got 6, and I think we can start. So hopefully we're in our spot, and welcome folks in the sanctuary. Welcome folks online. And just a note to anybody who's watching on Facebook, I posted a map earlier on Facebook. It's the same one that I've handed out here, or that Gina's handed out for me. And let's take just a quick look at that as we get ready, because we started last week talking about the problem that Paul fell into in Jerusalem. And if you remember last week, Paul, way back in chapter 21, Paul arrived in Jerusalem to bring the offering that he had been collecting, he and Timothy and Silas and etc., the offering that they'd been collecting from the Gentile churches to bring to the struggling, poverty-stricken Jerusalem Christians, the Jerusalem believers that were really facing a difficult situation there in Jerusalem. They were blackballed. No one would trade with them or buy from them or do business with them. The Jerusalem church had to suddenly start taking care of any Christian widows that were formerly, Orthodox Jewish widows that had formerly been taken care of by the Jewish community. Now they'd been dropped by that community, and the Christian church had to suddenly figure out a way to feed the poor widows. And anyway, Paul was bringing this offering, and the leaders of the Jerusalem church, including, James and the others who were the leaders, said, there is rumors out there that you're telling Jewish Christians that they don't have to follow any of the laws of Moses anymore, and that they should reject all of their Jewish heritage, and which Paul was not doing. But that rumor was out there because he was telling Gentile Christians that they didn't have to follow all the kosher laws, all the Jewish traditions. They had the Jerusalem conference where they said, as long as you stay away from sexual immorality and don't eat food that's been sacrificed to idols and food that's been strangled and don't drink blood or eat blood, you don't have to follow any of the other Jewish laws. That was the settlement for the Gentile Christians. But the rumor was that Paul had been teaching Jewish Christians that they didn't have to follow anything Jewish anymore. And the Jerusalem church said to Paul, you need to do something to show you are still a good Jew as well as a follower of Jesus. So Paul agreed to do this, help these men fulfill a Nazirite vow that has to do with shaving your head and abstaining from wine and meat, and then making an offering over a 30-day period. He agreed to be a part of that, help to pay for it. But in the middle of all that, he was accused of bringing Gentiles into the sacred parts of the temple where only Jews were allowed. He didn't do that. But some people accused him of it. They saw him with Gentiles and assumed he was bringing them into the temple, which he wasn't. But he was accused of it. That started a near riot. Paul's arrested. The crowd wants his blood. The Romans intervene. They arrest him basically for his own safety. And they're about to whip him, to interrogate him by lashing him or flogging him. He says, are you going to flog a Roman citizen? And they were like, what? You're a citizen? Yes. And then they kind of suddenly like, oh, no. So they take him before the Sanhedrin. The charges are very wishy-washy. He's a troublemaker. He's against the laws of Moses. They're very vague sort of accusations. He's taken back into custody by the Romans. The Jews have a plot to assassinate him, which is foiled. And so the decision is made that he needs to be transferred out of Jerusalem to the capital of that particular part of the empire, which was Caesarea. So the Felix, who's the regional governor, it would be a similar job to what Pilate had during the time of Jesus. Felix, the territorial governor, orders Paul to be sent to Caesarea, where he can be questioned and possibly tried there. He writes a letter. The regional commander there in Jerusalem writes a letter to Felix, saying, we're sending you this man, here's the details. And so we read that letter. We finished that off at the end of chapter 23, where Claudius Lysias, who is the sort of the commander of the forces there in Jerusalem, writes to the territorial governor of the Romans, Felix, saying, we're sending you this prisoner. Here's the melee that started when he was taken into custody. Hopefully you can sort it out. And they send him to Caesarea. So back to this map then. So you see, it starts at Jerusalem. It goes up to Caesarea. Okay? And we're going to be in Caesarea for a while. So we're going to pick up with chapter 24. Okay. 5 days later, so Paul is sent to Caesarea. 5 days later, the high priest, Ananias, went down to Caesarea. Went down from Jerusalem. Of course, we would say if they're going north, they're going up. But they don't think that way. Anytime you're leaving Jerusalem, you're going down. Anytime you're headed towards Jerusalem, you're going up. So he went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. Remember, in Judaism, when we're talking about a lawyer, we're talking about somebody who's an expert in the Jewish law. Not necessarily how we think of a lawyer, but an expert in the Jewish law. And they brought their charges against Paul before the governor, before Governor Felix, a Roman governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. And here's his accusation against Paul, 24, starting in the middle of verse 2. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. Okay. He says, we've enjoyed this long period of peace under you. Your foresight brought about reforms, most excellent. We acknowledge. The Tertullus knew that was a total lie. Felix knew that it was a total lie. It's total flattery. It's total buttering up. Felix had a horrible reputation of corruption. The Jews did not like him at all. The Jews considered him an enemy. So all this flattery, oh, most excellent Felix, we all know what a great job you do. No, it's all total lies, total flattery, he knew it was a lie. Felix knew he was not telling the truth. It's just a formality of flattery. So then he gets down to business. Verse 5. We have found this man to be a troublemaker. That's the charge against him. He's a troublemaker. He's stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him. The Jews joined in the accusation, asserting these things were true. Okay, let's see what he's actually being charged with here. First, he's a troublemaker, stirring up riots. Well, indeed, sometimes when Paul would preach in the synagogue, there would be opposition. And certainly, when this false accusation was made against him of entering the temple and bringing Gentiles into the restricted part of the temple, there was nearly a riot. But Paul is not at fault in any of that. Paul is the victim of all of that. But just the word riot to a Roman governor's ear, that immediately is like the one thing Rome, the empire, the one thing Rome would not tolerate was unrest. They would not tolerate unrest. They gave leeway to different geographical regions of religions and customs, but they would never tolerate unrest, riots, anything that smelled of an uprising. Again, I mentioned, I think last week, the reason the high priest was so worried about Jesus coming into town on Palm Sunday is they were afraid it would lead to an uprising. against Rome, and they knew that that would end in the death of many, many, many Jews. If Rome sensed that there was even a hint of an uprising, of a riot of any kind. So they accuse him of being behind rioting, which is false. They say he is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. And remember, by this point, there is a belief that this followers of Jesus are a sect, some would say a cult. And the whole idea of a sect, again, to Roman ears, they know there have been many in Judah and Galilee, many false messiahs who have tried to start revolutions, who have tried to raise up armies to overthrow the Romans. That was the typical way that false messiahs acted. They declared themselves Messiah, and they called for armed resistance and the overthrow of the Roman government. So they're trying to subtly link Paul to being some sort of insurrectionist. And then, of course, they also say he violated the temple, which he didn't do. So all these accusations are untrue. Everything they're accusing him of is untrue. But they're trying to do something that the Romans would consider dangerous. Just in the same way, when they brought Jesus to the Sanhedrin, he was found guilty of blasphemy. But by the time he got to Pilate, he was accused of being an insurrectionist. He was accused of being someone who wanted to overthrow the Roman government, a king of the Jews. So they know to get Rome to care, it has to be framed not as a religious matter, but as a matter of this is a danger to the peace of Rome. This man is somehow a danger to the peace of Rome. So, then, verse 10, the governor motioned for him being Paul, to speak. Paul replied. And here is Paul's rather lengthy self-defense, which is going to be covering some of the same points that we've heard him mention before. So I won't stop at all of it because we've heard him tell his testimony before. Paul said, I know that for a number of years, talking out of Felix, the Roman governor, there are a number of years you've been a judge over this nation, so I will gladly make my defense. He doesn't flatter him. He doesn't go on and on about what a wonderful leader he is, because he's not. He says, I know that for a number of reasons you've been a judge over this nation. I'll gladly make my defense. This is 24:11. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone in the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. They can't prove to you the charges they're now making against me. So he's basically refuting all these things. However, I do admit I worship the God of our fathers as a follower of the way, which is the early way of referring to the followers of Jesus, the way, capital W, which they call a sect. I believe everything that agrees with the law and that's written in the prophets. I have the same hope in God as these men. He's making a case that he is a faithful Jew. There will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. Then he talks about why is he in Jerusalem? Why did he come to Jerusalem? After an absence of many years, several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremoniously clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. He did not violate the temple, he's saying. There was no crowd with me. In other words, no Gentiles were there with him, which is what they're accusing him of. Nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. These are the ones who initially said, we saw him in the temple with Gentiles. You actually saw him there? Well, he was in the city with the Gentiles, so we assumed he was there. They made these accusations based on nothing. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today. Remember, Paul used that in the Sanhedrin as a way to basically divide the Sadducees from the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, the Sadducees did not. And when he said, I'm here because I believe in the resurrection, that split the the Sanhedrin into the two factions, and they start arguing amongst themselves. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, so Felix has an awareness of Christianity at this point. He has an awareness of Jesus and his followers. Adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. In ancient jails, they did not provide the food for the prisoners. You had to hope somebody outside would bring you food. You had to hope somebody outside would provide for clothing and anything else. The jail wasn't going to provide those things. Again, things we take for granted in our system were not part of an ancient system. So he is permitted to have friends come and help him and bring him food and bring him writing supplies and whatever else he might need. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess. She was more than a Jewess. She is part of the Herod family. So now, if you wouldn't mind, handing out the other handout. I'm going to hand out a rather complicated handout here. I looked for one that was as simple as we could find, but they're not easy. It's not an easy thing to. There's plenty for everybody to have one. There should be, I think. The Herod family figures prominently in the New Testament. And it is one convoluted mess of a family. So I want you to see where this family fits into this particular story. Okay. First, just why am I bringing up? Looking down at 13, if they're numbered here, the names are numbered. Number 13 is Drusilla. Okay. So Drusilla, who is married to Felix, the governor there, she, notice, is a daughter of King Herod Agrippa the First. Okay. So now, having established that, let's look from the top down. Okay, about the Herod family, which begins with Herod the Great. At the top, number one. Herod the Great, for most of us, is the best known part of this family, the patriarch, as it were, of this family, because we talk about him every Christmas. Because he's the one that the wise men go to when the wise men come searching for the king who has been born. We have seen his star. The Persian astronomers / astrologers, the Persian wise men who come to Jerusalem in search of the new king. And they go to the palace of Herod the Great, asking, where's the newborn king? And Herod has not had a baby recently, although he has a lot of kids, but it's obvious that's not who they're talking about. He gets his wise men and scribes and others to look up the scriptures. Where's the Messiah to be born? He's to be born in Bethlehem. And they go on their way to Bethlehem. And he says, yeah, let me know when you find him. I want to worship him too, which of course is a lie. And he then dispatches his soldiers to Bethlehem to kill every male baby under the age of 2 to wipe out this potential threat to his rule. That's Herod the Great. I mean, why is he the Great? Because of his building projects. The main one being the fact that he refurbished the temple. And just to remind us, I won't go into all of it again because I mentioned it before. Solomon built a magnificent temple. It was knocked down by the Babylonians in 586 BC. The Temple of Solomon was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Jews are taken into exile. When Cyrus the Persian becomes the new big dog in the world, and first it conquers the Babylonians, allows the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, the captives, and rebuild the temple. And that's in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, talk about that. They rebuild the temple, but nowhere close to the magnificent style of Solomon. Because they've been slaves, they've been captives. They're using whatever materials they can lay their hands on. So the second temple is nowhere nearly as beautiful and magnificent as Solomon's temple. But when Herod comes into power, he decides to try to bring the temple back up to the splendor of Solomon. He doesn't quite get it that good, but he does make major improvements. And that's why they refer to it as Herod's temple. And that's why he was called Herod the Great, because of his building projects. So, Herod the Great is the patriarch of this family. And notice the little line that says, he tried to kill Jesus. Here are his wives, the ones in red. There's 4 women listed as wives, and there's at least 6 other wives. So we had at least 10 wives, and some of them we don't know anything about, the ones that are kind of in the white over there. We only know really about Miriam the first, Matthias, Miriam the second, and Cleopatra, not that Cleopatra. Then you see which, who produces what children. And you see for example, you see Herod Antipas. He's the Herod that calls for John the Baptist's head to be cut off. Okay, he's that Herod. Okay, he is one of the sons of Herod the Great. Okay, mainly because he stole Herodias from her first husband, who was his half brother Herod Philip. Herod Philip is the first husband of Herodias. Herod Antipas steals her from his half brother, and she has a daughter that is Herod Antipas' stepdaughter, Salome. That is the one who does the dance that convinces him to grant her a wish, which she wishes for the head of John the Baptist. So that's that Herod. Then Herod Agrippa the first, number 9 there, he's the Herod who executed James, one of the 12 disciples, in the beginning of the book of Acts. He's also the Herod who threw Peter in prison. Okay? But we're looking at now Drusilla, number 13 there, who is the daughter of King Agrippa the first, and she is married to the Roman governor, Antonius Felix. Okay? So, this family is obviously a very messed up family. And later on in the saga of Paul, we're going to also meet Herod Agrippa II, who is who's the son of Herod Agrippa I, who is his siblings are Drusilla. So Herod Agrippa II and Antonius Felix are brothers-in-law. Drusilla is sister to both Herod Agrippa II and to Bernice. Bernice and Herod Agrippa II are brother and sister and also lovers. So, that's incest. So, you can see what a delightful family the Herod family is. This is the Herod family. And of course, it doesn't help us to keep a track that all the men have the name Herod. Notice there's often another name attached to it: Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, Herod Agrippa, etc., etc. But they're all Herod, and that makes it hard for us to keep track of. But the Herod family keeps coming into play all through the saga of Jesus and his disciples and Paul, etc. So we'll meet Bernice and Herod Agrippa II here shortly. So does that make sense? The Herod family, not the family you. I'd say if it was a reality TV show, it would be Meet the Herods, it would it would be much more complicated than even the Kardashians. It would be very, this is not the family you really want to be pals with. So later, now back in 24, several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess and a part of the Herod family. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ, Jesus. As Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "Well, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I'll send for you." Paul talking about things like righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come made Felix very uncomfortable because of his own lifestyle and his own everything. He's like, "Yeah, that's enough of that." And he says, I'll send for you sometime. At the same time, verse 26, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. Paul is not a man of great wealth, obviously. Maybe he's hoping that Paul's friends will offer a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. Anything else you want to bring up? Anything else you've been thinking about? Like maybe some money? No. So when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. So Paul is there 2 years waiting for some sort of resolution to these accusations made against him. He sits basically in custody for 2 years there in Caesarea with Felix, waiting for something to happen, and nothing happens for 2 years. Eventually, Felix is recalled by Rome because the Jews complained about him so much. Because there in Caesarea, there had been a scuffle between the Jewish population and the non-Jewish population there in Caesarea, and Felix had many of the Jews massacred, their homes ransacked, their property stolen, and the Jews complained to Rome, and Rome recalled him. And remember, he was a slave, and he was only a governor because his brother was a pal of Nero. So he's recalled. And they put in a new governor, Festus. It says, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. Felix knows he's in hot water with the Jews. He decides, rather than just letting Paul go, he's going to keep him in jail, lest the Jews make even more trouble for him. So he leaves Paul in jail, and the new governor is Festus. And a few people are old enough to remember on TV is Gunsmoke? Yeah. Was the deputy was Festus? Is that right? Yeah, okay. Some people, of course, like my kids' age, have no clue what Gunsmoke even was. So, anyway, so he's there now, still in Caesarea, and now Festus is the new sheriff in town, the new governor. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up to Caesarea to Jerusalem. He went from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They are not going to let this drop. 2 years later, they're still after Paul. They urgently requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing to ambush to kill him along the way. He's not nearly as safe in Jerusalem as he is in Caesarea. They want him there in Jerusalem where they can get their hands on him and ambush him and kill him. Break into the prison or whatever and execute him, assassinate him. Festus answered, Paul's being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there if he's done anything wrong. Festus's reputation is much better than Felix's. Historically, Festus has a much better reputation as being a straight shooter, down the middle kind of leader. So he has a good reputation. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. So you picture them just standing around, all pointing their fingers at him, yelling, what he had done wrong, that this man, is a danger, he's a troublemaker, he's blasphemous, etc., etc. Then Paul made his defense. I've done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Now, I will go to Jerusalem and hear the charges there in Jerusalem. He doesn't know that the plot is to kill Paul. Paul answered, I'm now standing before Caesar's court. In other words, this is an official Roman, position. You're a Roman governor where I ought to be tried. I've not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I don't refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Every Roman citizen ultimately could appeal their case to the emperor. I say every Roman. If it was a murder case, they couldn't. But cases like this, a Roman citizen, which Paul was a Roman citizen. Remember, most of the population of the empire are not citizens. But a Roman citizen could appeal his case to Caesar, to the city of Rome, and bypass any other court and appeal directly to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. In other words, at that point, everything stops. Okay, you've appealed to Caesar, and now we are under Roman law, we are compelled to get you to Rome, to get you to Caesar. Everything stops at that point. A few days later, so he's now appealed his case to Caesar. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Now, back to our chart here. See, down there, Numbers 10 and 11. That's Agrippa II and his sister, Bernice, which, again, most historians believe they were not just brother and sister, but they were more than that. That's why the little chart here has a little, heart with a question mark, like, eh. So remember, Bernice, Herod Agrippa II, and Drusilla are all siblings. Okay, so Felix and Drusilla, are married, but now Bernice and Herod are coming to see the new governor of that province, which is Festus. And remember, the whole territory of Rome had been divvied up into different parcels. Agrippa II still had, he was still considered, quote, the king of Galilee, which is a pretty small piece of the pie. Festus is governor over Judea, including Jerusalem. So this is a courtesy visit. When Herod was, quote, king, he wasn't truly a king in terms of having any independent power. He was really more of a governor, still under the Roman emperor. But Rome allowed him to use the title king, just as a favor, as a boon to him. He was called a king, even though he was still underneath the Roman emperor. So same way with this Agrippa II, he carries this title of royalty, but in reality, he still can't do anything without Rome's permission. So they come. Bernice and Herod Agrippa II come to visit now the new governor of the Judean area, which is Festus. So there's a royal visit. Verse 14. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, there's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it's not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he's faced his accusers, and has had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. When they came here with me, I didn't delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they didn't charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. He thought this was going to be something against Roman law. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion, about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on the charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. So that's a recap of what's happened. I thought this man had done something against Rome. I'm a Roman governor. They had some stuff about their own religion and about some dead guy named Jesus, and who they say was alive. And I don't understand anything about any of that. I don't know anything about that. So Agrippa says to Festus, "I'd like you to hear the man." Agrippa says, "Well, I'd like to hear this man myself." He said, "Okay, tomorrow you'll hear him." So now, this member of the Herod family, this descendant of Herod the Great who tried to kill Jesus as a baby, now here Paul is going to stand before his, is it great-grandson at that point? Let's see. Great-grandson. Paul's going to stand before his great-grandson. So, the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking officers and the leading men of the city. In other words, they're probably wearing royal robes, they're probably wearing purple, they're probably all dressed, in their finery as royalty. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. So, you got a room full of high muckety-mucks, you got people all dressed in their royal thing, and the military officers, and the governor had a special. The governor had a special sort of cloak as a sign of his power. They're all probably dressed in their finery, and they bring in Paul. He's probably dressed basically like a tent maker. Into this room full of these powerful people, including a king. They bring in this little Jewish tent maker, dressed probably very commonly. And yet, as one commentator said, even though they're all dressed in their finery, Paul immediately commands the room. His personality is such that it seems like he's the one there's power exuding from him. So, they bring him in. And Festus says, verse 34, "King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he's done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I've brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. I think it's unreasonable to send a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. Yeah, and you think about that. I'm sending you this prisoner for trial. What's the crime? Yeah, I don't know. Unclear. It's like, I can't send him to the emperor and say, this man's appealed to you. He's been found, been holding him prisoner for years. What's he done? I'm not really clear on that. You can't send a note like that. He's like, I got to get clear on what he has done against the Roman Empire before I can send him to the Roman emperor. So they bring him in. And Agrippa says to Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself. So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. In other words, you should know everything I'm going to talk about. The Jews all know the way I've lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They've known me for a long time and can testify, if they're willing, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. And now it's because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I'm on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. O king, it's because of this hope that the Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? So he's saying, I got a stuffed nose here. He's saying that, I am a loyal and faithful Jew, and I still am a loyal and faithful Jew, holding on to the promises given to our forefathers. I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that's just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the saints in prison. When they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished. I tried to force them to blaspheme. In my obsession against them, I even went to foreign cities to persecute them. So Paul is just laying out, yes, I too saw Christianity as a threat. I too saw this as a sect, as a cult. I saw this as a problem. On one of those journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. About noon, O king, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. Now, there's an expression that is not common in our culture. Anybody have a clue what that is? Kicking against the goads. Okay, when an ox was put under a yoke, a young ox, a new ox, they didn't like that. An ox did not like being put under a yoke and being told to pull a plow or, pull a whatever. Oxen didn't like that. So they would kick. They would kick and kick and kick to try to get away from that. So, and this is kind of cruel, to be honest, they would set up these goads that were these spikes so that if the ox kicked, it would kick against a spike. And if you kicked enough times against the spike, you're probably going to stop kicking. So basically what Jesus is saying to Paul is, in this persecution against my people, you're kicking against the goads. You're fighting against something, and it's biting you. It's hurting you. You're resisting the truth. Then I asked, 15, who are you, Lord? I'm Jesus, who you are persecuting. The Lord replied, now get up and stand on your feet. I've appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen of me and what I will show you. I'll rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I'm sending you to them to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So this is another version of the story we've already heard twice, in the Bible. We've heard Luke just tell us the story. We've heard Paul himself tell the story once before. But here he is telling the story to King Agrippa. So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. First to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem and in all Judea, and to the Gentiles also. I preached that they should repent and turn to God and prove their repentance by their deeds. That's why the Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But I've had God's help to this very day, and I stand here and testify to small and great alike. I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses would said would happen, that the Messiah would suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead, would proclaim light to his own people and to the Gentiles. So this is his summation of the message that he's been preaching. He says, what I am preaching is is nothing different from what Moses would have said, nothing that's different from what the prophets would have said when they talked about the coming Messiah, when they talked about God's plan, that God even says to Abraham, through your family, all nations on earth will be blessed. You know, he is saying everything he's doing is not contrary to Judaism, but is actually fulfillment of Judaism. So this is his case, and this is his sort of sermon/defense. At that point, 24, at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. "You're out of your mind, Paul." He shouted, "Your great learning is driving you insane." So this Roman governor acknowledges that Paul is a very learned person, but he's thinking this is crazy talk. And then Paul responds, "I'm not insane, most excellent Festus." He's addressing the governor with, respect. "What I'm saying is true and reasonable. The king," in other words, Herod Agrippa, "the king's familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it wasn't done in the corner. King Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? I know you do." So this is, when I say Paul is commanding the room, Paul is there. He's literally in chains. He's been brought in, chained up, all these people dressed in royal robes, and all these people, fancy people, all around in the room and all this. Paul's standing there talking with chains on his wrists, and he gets to this, and the governor says, "You're crazy." And he's like, "No, I'm not crazy." He says, "Everything I've said is, orthodox and true." And he says, "King Agrippa, he knows what I'm talking about. He's Jewish. He knows everything I'm saying is true." And then he addresses the king. He says, "So, King Agrippa, you believe in the prophets, don't you? I know you do. You believe in the prophets, don't you?" He basically puts Agrippa on the spot. The king. And Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" Like, you really think you're going to convert me right now? And Paul's reply is such a great reply. Because he says, "Do you think in such a short time you're going to persuade me to be a Christian?" Paul says, "Short time or long, I pray God that not only you, but all who are listening to me become what I am, except for these chains." I want everybody to be what I am, a follower of Jesus. I want everybody to be like me, except for these chains. At that, the king, has been put on the spot, made to feel uncomfortable. The king rose, with him the governor and Bernice and those sitting with him, and they left the room, and while talking with one another, they said, "This man's not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar." In other words, if Paul hadn't appealed to Caesar, they could have just said, "Yeah, you're free." But once he appealed to Caesar, he had to go to Caesar. He had to go to Caesar. So, I'm going to keep going. Matter of fact, just so you're wondering, we're going to finish tonight. So we're going to finish just 2 more chapters because we got time to finish tonight. So, they got to get him to Rome. They got to get him to Caesar. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, we meaning Luke is writing this, Luke's still with Paul. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. And here your map is going to come into play, this map. Okay, does everybody get one of these? And if not, Gina has them. If you didn't, anybody still needs one. Okay, they're in Caesarea, and you're going to see here the line of where they're going to go. From Caesarea on up, all along the edge of the Mediterranean, all along there, close to the shoreline. And you see them kind of getting close, then crossing down to Crete, to where it says Fair Havens. You're going to see the line that goes from Crete to Malta. It's drawn here as a nice straight line. It's not going to be a straight line. It's going to be a squiggly line because a storm is what's going to toss and turn them all along that journey. So anyway, but this is what you're going to see, and you're going to see finally it heads north and finally goes up to the boot, up to Italy. and up Rome just barely makes it onto the map there. But this is the journey they're going to have to make to get Paul to Rome. So, we set sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia. We put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends, because Paul has been to Sidon, so they might provide for his needs. So while they're there, the Roman centurion allows Paul to meet with some of his friends. From there, we put out to sea again, passed to the lee of Cyprus, and this is all, naval talk here, because the winds were against us. When we'd sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. I mean, this travel, you think it's been a travel nightmare here in the U.S. the last few weeks. I mean, there's no reservations. You got to find ships that are going the right way. And I mean, this takes a long time to go from basically, Israel, Caesarea, basically go from Israel all the way to Rome. I mean, you might say, well, that's not just across the Mediterranean. No, I mean, in these days, this is a hard journey. And you got to find ships going the right way. And usually the ships, they're going to be carrying prisoners. They're usually merchant ships that are carrying grain or something else. And they just, say, do you have space for people too? Matter of fact, we're going to learn later on, this probably is a ship loaded with grain. So, they find the ship, an Alexandrian ship, sailing for Italy, put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off of Cnidus. When the wind didn't allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast of difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. So that's where you get to Fair Haven. They're on Crete, the south part of the island of Crete. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. What fast are we talking about? In Jewish terms, what's the day of fasting in Judaism? Anybody know? The Day of Atonement, also known as Yom Kippur. So Paul warned them, men, and so we're talking about the spring. Okay. So Paul warned them, men, I can see, actually, no, not the spring, a little earlier than that. See that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, which you don't expect really the centurion to say, well, Paul says we should do this. Well, he's a prisoner. Paul says this is going to be bad. This is going to be bad. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Well, yeah, that doesn't seem odd that the centurion is going to listen to the captain and the owner of the ship and not to a prisoner. Since the harbor there at Fair Havens was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. There was a harbor there. So they're wanting to get to this place. They're wanting to be able to winter in a better place. Find a place to reach Phoenix. Well, here's where the troubles really begin. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they'd obtained what they wanted. They thought this is okay, we can sail now. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the Northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by storm and couldn't head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, and you see that there, Cauda, just a speck, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. They're afraid the whole ship is going to come apart. They got ropes that they're cinching to hold the ship together. Fearing that they would run aground in the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. So they are just being driven along by the hurricane-force winds, and that's why I say this line should really be a squiggle there and not a straight curve. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. The storm was such, they couldn't see the sun, they couldn't see the stars, they couldn't see anything. They couldn't see where they were, they couldn't navigate by the stars, they couldn't tell where they were. And they gave up. They said, we're dead. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, this is the prisoner. Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. You can't help but say, I told you so. You should have taken my advice and not sailed from Crete. And then you would not have you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. Now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God who I am, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage. Keep up your courage, men. I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So Paul says, God, an angel has told me we're going to live. We're not going to die. The ship's going to be destroyed, but we're going to live. On the 14th night of the storm, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight, the soldiers sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again, found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be lashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you can't be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. The sailors were trying to get out now. Paul said, without the sailors, we'll never make it. So the soldiers cut the ropes so that the sailors could not take off on their own. Just before dawn, Paul urged them to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this is a prisoner. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God. He took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. He broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they'd eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they didn't recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach. They decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. They hoisted the foresail to the wind, made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and wouldn't move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent them from swimming away and escaping. Remember, the law of Rome was, if a soldier allowed a prisoner to escape, the soldier would suffer the penalty that prisoner was going to suffer. If you were transporting a prisoner who was going to be executed and you let him go, you would be executed. The soldier would be executed. That's why, the Philippian jailer, when Paul and Silas were in the dungeon and the earthquake hit, remember the soldier in Philippi prepared to commit suicide. He took out his sword to kill himself because he knew, well, they're going to escape and then they're going to torture and kill me. So I'm just going to finish it now. And that's when Paul said, no, don't do it. We're all here. We're not running away. And that's why the Philippian jailer, if you remember, said to Paul, basically, what do I have to do to be saved? In other words, you're my enemy. Why do you care if I live or die? Why do you care if I kill myself? I just whipped you and put you in the stocks. Why are you trying to save my life? And that is what turned the Philippian jailer into a believer in Jesus. But that was the Rome. The Rome didn't mess around. That's how they kept the soldiers vigilant. If you let a prisoner go, well, whatever he was guilty of and whatever punishment he was about to get, you're going to get it. So they were going to kill all the prisoners on the ship. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. So they survived the shipwreck. Once safely on shore, we found out the island was called Malta. And you see Malta here is a dot. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. This is Luke. Remember, Luke's a part of this. Luke's on this ship too. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire, welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer. For though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." They're like, he's gonna face justice from the snake if the sea didn't kill him. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire, suffered no ill effect. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. So, it's a pretty quick switch from he's a murderer who's about to face justice and die to he must be a god if he survived a snake bite. So they're kind of go from one extreme to the other. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. So Paul heals basically the governor of this little island, heals his father. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. So people are coming Paul, and Paul's praying for them, and they're healed. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with supplies we needed. After 3 months, see, this journey has taken a long time. After 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. So there was another ship there in Malta. They were able to get passage on another ship. It was an Alexandrian ship with the figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. We put in at Syracuse, stayed there 3 days. There we set sail and arrived at Rhegium. Next day, the south wind came up. On the following day, we reached Puteoli. We found some brothers who invited us to spend a week with them, and we came to Rome. We came to Rome. Paul, if you remember, when Paul's letter to the Romans, when he writes the letter to the Romans, the book of Romans, he had never been to Rome. He had never been to Rome. Most of his letters are written to churches that he helped found. When he's writing to the Corinthians, when he's writing to these other churches, these are towns that he had personally been to. Paul, when he wrote the letter to the Romans, he had never been to Rome. In some ways, that's why Rome is many people say is the most important of all of his letters, because the other letters he's often kind of answering questions, and we don't always know the other side of the conversation. But Rome, he didn't know anything about Rome, except he knew there was Christians there. So the letter to the Romans is more like a full explanation of Christianity. I mean, he lays out Christianity in the book of Romans in a much fuller way than any other letter, because he doesn't know what they know and what they don't know. So Romans is his really most important letter for us, because it lays out his teaching and his theology more completely than any of his other letters. So, but now, in chains, he finally gets to Rome. Paul finally arrives in Rome. The brothers there had heard that we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. At the sight of these men, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. So, when we think about Paul's imprisonment in Rome, we sometimes think about him in a jail cell or a dungeon or something. No, he basically was able to live in a small sort of apartment and with a guard constantly with him. It wasn't a prison, it was a private, probably little apartment or little house or something. And he was able to, he couldn't leave, but he could receive guests. People could come and bring him food. People could come and talk to him. People could come and get letters from him to deliver. So he couldn't leave because he's literally there with a guard. And it's unclear as to whether he was literally chained to that guard, 24/7. Of course, the guards would not be the same guy all the time. They'd change shifts or whatever. But he's there with a guard in some sort of private place as he awaits his trial with Nero. Nero the madman. Nero, the worst emperor ever in the history of the Roman Empire. Nero, the malicious, bloodthirsty emperor. So, verse 17, 28:17. 3 days later, he called together the leaders of the Jews, the Jewish population of Rome. When they'd assembled, so Paul is able to receive people to visit with him. He's able to receive guests and visitors. When they'd assembled, Paul said to them, "My brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me because I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. But when the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had any charge to bring against my own people. For this reason, I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain." They replied, "We haven't received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of the brothers who have come from there have reported or said anything bad about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect being Christianity. We know that Jews everywhere are saying this Christianity thing, these Jesus followers, that this is a problem, that this is a dangerous sect." They arranged to meet Paul on a certain day and came in even larger numbers to the place where he was staying. From morning till evening, he explained and declared to them the kingdom of God and tried to convince them about Jesus from the law of Moses and from the prophets. Some were convinced by what he said, others would not believe. They disagreed among themselves and began to leave after Paul had made this final statement. "The Holy Spirit spoke the truth to your forefathers when he said through Isaiah the prophet, 'Go to this people and say, you will be hearing but never understanding. You will be seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused and hardly hear with their ears. They hardly hear with their ears, and they've closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts. In turn, I would heal them.' This is a pretty well-known passage from Isaiah 6, 9, and 10. He says, therefore, I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles, and they'll listen. So some Jews there in Rome believe his teaching and believe what he's presenting about Jesus. Other, seeming like even more Jews, do not. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. Boldly and without hindrance, he preached the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ. And you're like, wait a minute, that's the end? That's the end of the book? That's the end of the book? That's the end of the story? And, of course, people always like, well, why does it end there? You know, why does it not tell us Paul's final, what happens to him? Does he get executed? Does he, what happens? Well, almost all tradition is that Paul does indeed eventually is executed, because Nero is so crazed in his desire to blame all of Rome's woes on Christians. We talked before about how the great fire of Rome, Nero blamed the Christians for. The emperors saw Christianity as a threat, and so the reality probably is that Paul was executed. Now, because he was a citizen, if he was executed, he had the privilege of being beheaded, as opposed to something like crucifixion. Crucifixion was a gruesome way of dying that took hours and hours and even days to die. I mean, it was meant to be torture. If you were a citizen and you were found worthy of death, they beheaded you, which was, very quick. So it was merciful to behead you as opposed to execute you by a more painful method. And which, is actually part of history all along the way. Do you know who invented the guillotine? A physician. A doctor invented the guillotine as a way to execute people as quickly and painlessly as possible, as opposed to somebody standing there with an axe, where it might take, several attempts to take off somebody's head. The guillotine was invented by a doctor in an attempt to make execution less torturous. So a Roman citizen was beheaded as a privilege, but Paul was almost undoubtedly executed, probably beheaded. That's what we believe. Now, some people think there's a minority of scholars who think that Paul eventually was released. And, Paul always had said one of his dreams was to preach in Spain. And some people think that he was released and actually got to go to Spain. That's a minority of scholars who think that happened. Most scholars believe he probably never left Rome and he probably was executed. But again, the question is, well, why does Luke end the story there? Why does Luke stop there? Because you can still, that last verse 30, does definitely, or 31, definitely seems like a wrap up. He was there 2 years. He kept boldly preaching. The only true answer is we don't know. Some say, well, Luke doesn't know. He doesn't know what happened for some reason. We do know that when Paul was in Rome in prison, he wrote Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians, Philemon. A great number of the books of the New Testament were written by Paul from Rome in prison. And so much of what we have in the New Testament are what Paul wrote during at least those 2 years while he was in Rome, writing to those churches. And you think how incredibly valuable those letters are to us even today. Some have said that, well, why Why in there? Well, from a standpoint of literature, what is the book of Acts about? How did the gospel go from Jerusalem to Rome? How did the gospel travel from Jerusalem to Rome? Well, but I mean, the book starts in Jerusalem and it ends in Rome. In other words, the theme of the book is how did the gospel travel? And how did it eventually get to the center of the world? Because when the gospel reaches Rome, I mean, here symbolically, as Paul gets to Rome, I mean, the gospel had already reached Rome. There were already Christians in Rome. But if you think symbolically, Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee is a pretty backwater part of the empire. Really, none of the Roman officials wanted to serve in Rome, in Galilee or Jerusalem, or I mean, they didn't. That was the sticks. Once Christianity finds a root in Rome, the capital of the world, then it can spread out all directions. When the gospel hits Rome, it can go everywhere from Rome. The one we think Rome, has great points and negative points. It was brutal in many ways, but the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. I mean, Rome basically was peaceful for a few centuries, and that stability allowed the gospel to move. The Roman roads allowed letters and things to move. I mean, the Pax Romana allowed the gospel to spread. And some said, well, the book of Acts is how did the gospel get from Jerusalem to Rome? But we definitely wish we knew more. I think I may have mentioned, and I'll wrap up here, when Janine and I went to Italy, it's been several years ago. When Janine and I went on a trip to Italy with a group, one of those group things. It wasn't a Christian group. It was just a Italian, tour of Italy group, secular group. We had landed, in Rome at the airport, and we were, driving into the actual city of, where the Colosseum and all that is. We're driving into the center of Rome. And the tour guide is telling us, oh, there's this and there's that. And we drive by and he points at this church and he says, that's the church of St. Paul outside the wall. And I'm like, okay, what's that? He says, that's where Paul is buried. St. Paul. And I was like, are we going there? No, we're not going there. I'm like, we're not going there? We're not going where St. Paul is? Now, anytime a church says they have the remains of one of the apostles, is it really, really, really them? There's always a little bit of doubt. Is that really them? But this church is called St. Paul outside the wall. What it means outside the wall, outside the traditional walls surrounding the city of Rome. And so it was outside of the traditional walls of Rome. But on our one free day, Janine and I got there. We navigated the Italian, subway and everything else, and we got to St. Paul outside the wall, and that is where traditionally Paul is buried. Just like traditionally Peter is buried at St. Peter's Basilica. But I found it, I had a need to be there, at least to go there. But how Paul died, when Paul died, and especially where he was buried is pretty murky in terms of anything definitive. But luckily we have 13 letters of Paul, and we have Luke's accounting of this part of his life, and we know a whole lot. We know a lot about Paul. We don't know everything about him, but we know a whole lot about him. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I wasn't sure I would need. I got done a week early, but I think that's okay. So any before I pray, any comment, question, thing, dangling thing that I somehow left dangling somewhere? I'll be honest, even though I've been to that church, what, quote, evidence they have, in most cases, the story of how a saint ended up buried at a particular church, it's always a pretty convoluted, well, not convoluted, it's usually like there's a lot of, the bodies got moved a lot before they ended up where they ended up. St. Mark's Square in Venice, San Marcos in Venice, that's where Mark, as in Mark the apostle, Mark the evangelist, Mark the writer of the book of Mark, is supposedly buried at St. Mark's Square. But some people stole his body from a Muslim country where his body had been buried. And the story that they tell you at St. Mark's Square, well, how did they get the body away and get it to Italy? Well, they smuggled it out in a barrel of pork, because that way they knew the Muslims would not inspect it because they wouldn't touch the pork. So they smuggled his body out in a barrel of pork. Now, again, that's a story from hundreds of years ago, and if there's any veracity to it, we don't know. Raleigh. It's kind of like, when you go to the Holy Land, they'll say this is the upper room. Well, maybe, but I've been there. Is that the actual upper room? Well, maybe, but we don't know. Even when you go to the Church of the Nativity, which is where supposed the spot where the manger was, is that the spot? Maybe. But absolutely. What you do we've gone to the Holy Land twice. What you do know is when you're on the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Galilee. That's where Jesus and the disciples were in their boat. You do know you're on the real Sea of Galilee. When you go to Capernaum, the ruins of the synagogue, Jesus stood there. There's places you do know for sure this is the place. Sometimes the other places, like the site of the Nativity or the site of the upper room, we're less sure about. So, and I guess especially when a church says, well, Saint so-and-so is buried here. Maybe, but we don't know for sure. Anyway. Yeah, and a lot of those churches were built several hundred years after the disciples died. So, anyway, but it's still cool. It's very cool to go there. It's just, you have to know, what we absolutely know for sure, and what we think we might know. But anyway, let me pray. Lord, we're grateful for this man, Paul, who started off as a persecutor and became a great evangelist and missionary. And Lord, we are thankful for people like him all through the decades, all through the centuries, who have spread the word so that we would know it and hear it today. And we thank you for these letters that we still have that give us insight into his ministry. And we just thank you, Lord, that you called him and that he used his talents and his personality to bring so many to know Jesus. We pray in your name. Amen.